either lightly or not at all connected to the text. In many cases, the preacher won't even refer back to the passage. This, to me, is a tragedy and a waste of audience time. When a preacher has exegeted a text, which means to bring out the meaning, then the fruit of that good work becomes the fabric of the sermon. Selecting a sermon text is also important to the process. Now, how do we select a text? How is that determined? Well, there are several ways. First of all, personal reading and study of the Bible by the preacher himself. This practice will continually give the preacher plenty of sermon text ideas. And of course, it's very important for the preacher to stay in the Word himself. Number two, the needs of the congregation. A pastor should know his people and what scriptural truth will best aid them. And so he needs to spend some time with them in order to find that. Number three, book or theme series. Lots of preachers can preach through a book or pick a theme like unity in the church or love, and this will lead to a multi-week plan for preaching. It also can save you a little time. Number four, the church calendar or events. Regardless of denomination, special days require special types of sermons. Lord's Supper days, Mother's Day, Easter, etc. A good rule of thumb, I think, is to use all four of these methods for selecting biblical texts to preach. This will keep you from always preaching the same themes or sections of the Bible. And by the way, your people need a full menu of biblical truth. Now, when we get to biblical sermons, there are certain elements of a biblical sermon. There are several elements that one will find in every good biblical sermon. Now, they're not equally important, and they will appear in different ways according to sermon structure. But they all serve a purpose, and that purpose will help us to communicate the message. Preachers with less experience may want to work on each of these elements and construct sermons very carefully until they become more experienced and intuitive in the process. Now, many of the following elements will be dealt with at length in later sessions. And once again, let me remind you that not all of these elements will show up in the same way in every sermon, but you will find them somewhere in there. The first element that I would like for us to consider is that we read the text when we preach a sermon. All sermons should include the reading of a sermon biblical text. Now, when you pick a text and you're reading it at the beginning of a sermon, practice this so that it doesn't appear that you're reading it for the very first time. To me, when a preacher stumbles over the words and the pronunciation, it always kind of gives the impression to the audience that, well, it's the first time he's looked at it. Of course, we don't want that. It not only forces the congregation to read it, or at least to hear it, but it introduces what you will be talking about in the biblical sermon that you're about to preach. Now, an introduction always comes with a sermon too. Now, you may say, I don't do introductions, but every sermon begins some way. That's the introduction. Now, these are the first words that your audience will hear from you in this sermon. And you do not want to start a sermon in a poor way. You want to craft an introduction that accomplishes some of the following points. First of all, it sets the connection between the biblical text and the sermon to follow. When I'm giving an introduction, I always want to take that text that I've just read and then in the introduction show them that it's going to be used throughout the rest of the sermon. A second quality of an introduction is to convince the audience that the text and the sermon relate to them in some way. I want to set relevance here. I want them to know that the next 20 minutes or so that they're listening to this sermon, that this text has something to say to them. Now, thirdly, I want to interest them. I do not want to bore them in an introduction. If I bore them to begin, I may never get them back. So an introduction should always be an interesting beginning. Now, one of the things that you should remember is always write the introduction to your sermon last, not first. It should truly introduce what is about to follow in the sermon. If I write the introduction first, then sometimes that gets everything after that following the introduction. The other way around sometimes results in a sermon written to fit a good introduction rather than a sermon written to bring out the truth.